This episode is being brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. To get a free demo, check out the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. This week on the show, we have Dr. David Guru. Dr. Guru is a practicing radiation oncologist and the founder of PRIMR. PRIMR creates IRB-ready digital patient education content for clinical trials by pairing board-certified physicians with graphic designers and patient advocates. He practices medicine at a Yale affiliate cancer center in Hartford, Connecticut. In this episode, we discuss how patient education happens at clinical research sites, how to keep patients engaged through ongoing education, and how video content can improve patient care. So without further ado, Dr. David Guru. All right, Dr. David Guru, I appreciate you coming on, man.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me, Brad. I'm looking forward to it.
Where are you at?
So I'm in Connecticut. I grew up here actually, but left for, college, med school, everything, and got a job back here about 7 years ago working at a Yale affiliate cancer center. So back home, played poker with the same guys I went to kindergarten with, and not the most exciting town on earth, but it's perfect for my family.
Nice. Yeah. Hey, there's a lot to be said for quiet, and I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let's jump right in. You've already kind of hinted a little bit about your background here, but I think it's always kind of fun to hear about how people fell into clinical trials. I know what you do is well beyond just clinical trials specifically, but tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you into the clinical trial space, if you would.
Yeah, so my background is I am a radiation oncologist. So I see patients with cancer, and radiation oncologists, as most of your audience probably knows, we use X-rays instead of chemotherapy to treat cancer patients. And I work about 3/4 time in a practice in Hartford, Connecticut at a Yale affiliate cancer center. But how I got into clinical trials is kind of a longer story. I mean, just the 30,000 foot view as a pre-med, I just was really into using visuals for learning. When I was studying organic chemistry and biochemistry, I just would sketch out quite a bit. That was just how my brain worked. I found it easier to understand these concepts when I was pairing all the words and sort of the visuals and the pathways and everything with simple visuals. And I kind of kept that going through med school. I was teaching as a medical student. I was teaching undergrads who were studying for the MCAT to apply to med school, to basically teach at a whiteboard and make simple visuals to kind of explain these complex concepts for the students who were studying. And carried that practice of pairing my explanations with visuals right into my medical practice. So as an oncologist, I routinely do this. When someone's coming to see me with a new diagnosis of prostate cancer, I'll draw out the pelvis and kind of all the organs that are in the area where the prostate is. And this helps them understand kind of the disease process and the treatment options and what the risks are of each treatment option and everything. And during the pandemic, like the early days, patients had to come alone with a new diagnosis of cancer. And so they couldn't bring a family member. No one was there to help them take notes to better understand this, or kind of run the tape, if you will, after you leave the clinic. And so I had this idea to start taking these paper drawings that I was using and convert them into short 2 to 3 minute videos that are chunked down into different parts of cancer explanations. And I built a big library of about 50 videos that I could share with my patients so they could consume them later at home, share them with their family, and kind of have this little memento of the explanation, that little moment we had in the office. And I just kind of hum along doing that, building it in public and sharing it, free resource for patients and everything. But then a friend who's a cancer researcher and PI reached out, and he was describing to me the painful problem he had of introducing his complex trials to patients. And kind of things took off a little bit from there. So that's how I really more recently got into the clinical trial space.
Yeah. And I mean, that's seemingly super intuitive, but honestly, something I haven't really seen a lot of. I've been working in the clinical trial side for almost 15 years, but we don't get a lot of great visuals to help with patients, and especially in an area that's already pretty complex like oncology, right? Which a lot of people don't fully appreciate or understand, and then throw in the complexities of a clinical trial on top of that. I mean, this seems like a sort of a no-brainer. So, I mean, have you been a PI or sub-I in trials even before this, or it just sort of came through the art itself, I guess?
As a resident, I was involved in writing some trials, like designing and writing trial protocols. Although, residency is sort of a transitory phase in life. So I was very involved in the writing of it, but wasn't involved in the implementation, recruitment, and carrying out the trial itself because I moved on, finished residency and moved on elsewhere. I ended up finding that private practice was a better fit for my personality. I'm just really into patient care and taking care of the patient across from me. And so academics was a less appealing path. So I got away from the more academic aspects of clinical trials once I finished residency. But as a resident, I was really involved in clinical research, not just writing protocols, but also, writing up manuscripts, publishing papers from, research that was done by residents who were, 5 or 10 years prior to me. I was sort of reaping the benefits of their work. So very involved in the space just as a medical student and resident, but as a professional, like now that I'm in practice, it's been more through the art.
Gotcha. So like it's taken on a life of itself at this point. It's its own project or own company at this point?
It is its own company. Yeah. So I called it PRIMR, which is just sort of a way to kind of signify that this is not replacing anything. It's just sort of like a quick intro. Obviously we still need to meet with our patients in person, but it's a way to sort of amplify the simple message behind a trial to introduce it to patients and families. But yeah, it's a company. We're a small company, but we basically are just pairing up with innovative PIs and some innovative sponsors that are looking to explore different ways to leverage short, simple, video versions of the one pager patient education, like literal paper that we often would give to patients for trials, and convert it into something they can just consume on their mobile device, which makes a ton of sense. So kind of early days, but working with teams that are like, oh, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Maybe we can work together and produce some content and see if that helps our patients or helps with recruitment, or in some cases, even just amplify the message among the doctor community, among doctors who would be enrolling on the trial. So I would say I've really enjoyed listening to your pod because it's helping me really understand on a very practical level what the considerations are at the site level, because that's just not something I've had exposure to. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Well, first of all, just how patient education about specific trials takes place at the site level, and then what kinds of innovative things you see coming on the horizon there.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, and perfect dovetail here, because I think a problem we often find, especially as we do a lot of advertising, so we get a lot of inbound phone calls. And, it can be complicated to explain in a short period of time, to a patient over the phone, especially where you can't even sort of visualize. And, the alternative might be to send them a consent form ahead of time, which has its flaws. You don't want to send somebody 49 pages for them to read through. That's, pretty dense with protocol requirements or legal verbiage. Oftentimes that scares patients away, and it still doesn't even really give them a good idea of what the trial could actually consist of. So I love this idea of being able to send sort of a short explainer or, primer, if you will. Yeah. I think that's a huge advantage that can engage patients right away, not sort of overwhelm them with, again, this huge document, but sort of get the point across. And again, we haven't really seen a lot of that. I haven't in my years. And again, it seems so almost just obvious, I guess, even though not in any derogatory way, but it seems obvious that we should be, providing these sorts of solutions, because again, we don't see it.
Yeah. I mean, one of my core beliefs in just like my approach, my philosophy to medicine is that patients suffer less if they understand more. So I think just like a small dose of education up front, what even is metastatic disease? Like, what does that mean? I mean, many patients who have metastatic disease, when they come to see a radiation oncologist, don't even quite understand what that means. That the cancer, so you got in my bloodstream, and now it's in other organs of my body. Like, how did that happen? And so they really do need kind of like a very basic level explanation, usually with visuals. I mean, it works much better to just get them to kind of like a decent ground floor level of education. So, because obviously when patients start to understand the concept of metastatic disease, their very next question is, what are we going to do about this? This seems like a really big problem. So that's where the whole idea came from, is just, it's much easier. I don't enroll many patients on trials, but it's much easier. My job is to recruit their participation in a standard of care treatment. So it's much easier for me to recruit patients to participate in a standard of care treatment program that involves, potentially side effects, toxicity, and things like that, if they understand the problem really well. So that's sort of where it came from. And I think what my kind of early customers and partners have taught me is that an issue that they have in recruitment is that they have to explain the whole standard of care waterfront first, which is complex, as you said. Like, oncology is complex to start. And then they need to go a level up beyond that to explain, like, well, here's an option that's available to you that's above and beyond the standard of care in the form of a clinical trial. So the level of complexity is ratcheted up yet another few clicks on the complexity ladder. And so education is even more important in that context.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to put a pin in something that you said. I love the idea of sort of you're recruiting them into the standard of care treatment. I guess I've never thought about it that way, but I mean, you still need their consent and they need to be along for the ride, to be active participants, in that process, which, I think about in terms of clinical trials, but it's an interesting way to frame it, even just from their standard of care course of treatment, right? They still need to be active participants in that process. I love that. Again, I love that way of looking at it. And, to your point, yeah, you sort of, you have these layers in a clinical trial. First, understanding what the disease or disease process is. Maybe patients don't need to fully understand like every mechanism of action of every drug, but if you can at least provide like, look, here's what exists and here's what your options are. Here's why they're different. Here's why we think they're better. And again, doing that in a way that's actually engaging. Because I've gone through these consent processes and watched people slowly tune out.
You just see like the curtains come down. Yeah. I mean, that happens in standard of care conversations too, but I can't imagine what it's like on a complex trial,
Well, and ultimately a better educated patient is a better research participant, right? I mean, that's almost always the case because, they're interested, they're active in the process and they want to, be involved. So the more you can educate them in a way that they understand, because look, I've been doing this a while, but I'm not a doctor and there's still a lot of stuff I don't understand on a very granular level. So relating that to here, we have a ton of rural population. They're not necessarily super educated, being able to make that accessible to them is incredibly important. And again, I think it's been really undervalued, specifically, in the clinical trial process, probably, all across the treatment spectrum, but, certainly across clinical trials.
Yeah. I mean, I think one nut to crack is the recruitment and, getting patients to enroll. But then ongoing engagement is just as important, right? You could sign up 100 participants, but if 50 of them kind of fall off and are lost to follow up and your data is garbage and you don't have any reasonable conclusions from the trial, so it's just a bunch of wasted time and money. And those other poor participants who did fully participate, it was all for naught because we can't make heads or tails of the outcome. So ongoing engagement, I completely agree with you that ongoing engagement is a large part driven by the education. And by that, I don't mean whether or not that patient went to college. It's whether or not that patient truly understands the disease process. And the way that I create my content is kind of aiming for, before we were recording, we were just referencing our kids, and my kids are in 4th grade. So it's like, I want them to understand it like in a year, like a 5th grade level is kind of like what I'm shooting for, because if you can get a 5th grader to understand a clinical trial, then that seems like about the appropriate level. I don't care if a person is like a PhD in pharmacokinetics or never even finished high school. You can create content, educational content for trials that both of them can equally understand,
Well, yeah, and I didn't even really occur to me in the beginning of, in my mind, a lot of the issue is recruitment or sort of awareness and education up front, but there's no reason this couldn't be something that's rolled out throughout the course of a trial too, to say like, okay, we're at 12-week mark. Here's, the protocol is changing, or maybe the treatment is changing, and here's why. Again, to your point, and recruitment's one step, but ongoing engagement. And again, that's oftentimes also really overlooked in clinical trials is, get them in the door and consent them. But then how are you going to keep them engaged for, hell, in oncology trials, maybe years, maybe the rest of their lives, depending on what kind of trials you're looking at. It's a tall order. Again, we're not provided many resources at the site level to really, really do that. But again, I think if you can walk patients through that journey with some visuals and something that's easy to understand, it can be a real game changer in terms of not just recruitment, but retention.
Yeah, I agree. And I kind of learned this early on. We were initially building content that was like 5 minutes long, and it took patients through kind of the whole arc of the trial through follow-up and everything. And we found that with a video of that length, retention isn't great. After about the 2-minute mark, you start having patients kind of falling off, which is not surprising, right? Everybody's attention span is like narrowing down to TikTok level. But
right.
So what we've done more recently, we just started a pilot project at Columbia with New York Presbyterian, larger system, but mostly at Columbia in terms of their oncology centers. But basically, we're taking an educational program for women who are going to get radiation for breast cancer and are going to be at risk for developing lymphedema, where there's some exercises that you can do kind of early on during treatment and shortly after treatment to lower the risk of developing lymphedema, or have early detection that would prompt an early referral to lymphedema specialists for rehab and physical therapy and stuff. So we decided, instead of making like a huge 10-minute video that we would serve to patients all up front, split it into 3 videos where patients get served content at the beginning, where it's really just, this is what lymphedema is, just general, like 30,000 foot view of the process, just so they understand as they go through, and then just have like this heightened awareness around the idea that this is something that could happen. Then after they finish, we serve them with content around the exercises. So like, this is a potential risk, but here are the things that you can do to empower them to take some ownership and control over the outcome. And then ultimately, the final video is more around recognizing the early signs of lymphedema, so that even if, in spite of the preventative exercises they've done, they do notice some concerning findings, they can get referred to have this managed by a professional. So taking the content and splitting it into smaller bites and explaining to patients that they'll get served the content in smaller bites seems to be probably a winning strategy for ongoing engagement and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love that concept of sort of chunking the data out, rather than serving it all up at once. Again, I think that can make a big difference. And as you point out, people's attention spans are growing. I love the idea of sort of chunking out, the information, because, the few times we have had sort of video or visuals for studies, it's like a 20-minute. You want to watch a 20-minute video? That's not gonna do it. Yeah. Again, after sitting there, they're like, no, they're screwing around on their phone, within the first 5 minutes, and I don't blame them. But, I love the idea too of, as I think about this, it seems like there's just so many opportunities to incorporate this, like, being able to shoot out some content about your next upcoming trial visit. You're going to have blood drawn, you're going to have an EKG. Here are the things that are going to happen. Here's what we're looking at. Boom. And they come in, they have the expectation, what's going to go on and how it's going to work. It feels like there's a lot of room to sort of supplement what sites are already doing or sponsors are already doing, in terms of, again, having patients engaged and prepared.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And one insight that I had just from my medical practice and talking with friends is, even like 5-7 years into your practice, you already notice that, that was like not my best performance with a patient. You have great days where you feel like you're really nailing it, and you just like, you had a great connection with the patient, great interaction. You feel great about how they feel about their disease and they're feeling empowered to go and tackle it. And then you have days where you're like, either you're exhausted or you just haven't had your coffee yet or whatever it is. You're not, for whatever reason, you don't bring your very best performance and you know it. And you feel awful because the patients don't deserve that. They need your very best every single time. The nice thing about content is if it's well done, it's a backstop. It's never going to replace. We don't want to live in some dystopian future where instead of doctors, you just here, watch this video and get this IV. Like you still need a human to walk you through it.
Right.
But content can, if it's well placed, if it's integrated smartly into the patient journey, it can really enhance the experience because it can prompt their thinking ahead of a visit and, give them the questions. A lot of patients are just having anxiety around like coming up with a smart or a good question. And so if you serve them with like short, but very specific, like 2-minute piece of content, and then they're going to see their doctor 20 minutes later, that can serve as, again, a little bit of a primer to sort of get their mind in the right place to answer the right, to ask the right questions. And both parties, the patient and the doctor or the research team, are kind of getting the most satisfaction and gratification out of those encounters rather than the providers and the research team kind of feeling like the broken record of just like saying the same script over and over and over, which can drive burnout and also leads to like degrading performance over time. So that's just something I've seen in using this kind of stuff in my own medical practice with standard of care treatments. I've just seen like, patients check in. If I know their diagnosis, I have my MA check them in. We serve them with a text message through the web app. So they just get a text message, click on it, they watch a 2-minute video, and then 5 minutes later, I walk in. And they have usually very specific questions about certain aspects. So we know kind of where to navigate the discussion rather than me kind of starting from scratch. I have no idea where they stand on their understanding and that kind of stuff. So it does speed things up and it makes things a little bit more targeted in terms of our conversation.
Yeah, I like that you can sort of lay that foundation. And to your point, not because, I find myself doing that and throughout consent processes, pretty soon you're just mindlessly, sort of reciting what you've been reciting for so long. And when you do that, you sometimes miss out on nuance or you're not giving attention to the places where it needs to go because you're kind of on autopilot. So no, I can appreciate how that can change the game there. I'm also curious about things like beyond, and I don't know if this is like within your scope or something you've thought about, but beyond just the medical aspects or even the clinical trial specific, like, patients have to deal with, and clinical trials have to deal with like, electronic patient reported outcomes and different vendor systems, maybe like, are those things you guys have looked at, serving up content around as well to potentially make their experience in a trial easier or, more fulfilling?
So just in sort of a theoretical stage, but we haven't built anything in that space yet. More at this stage, I'm just kind of looking for like-minded people who are wanting to partner, whether they be like the PIs, the sponsors, the site level. I haven't worked with any CROs, but I've worked with pretty much every other level to just better understand, not just, so the content is one part of it, but then the other part, which you can speak to more than me, is how do you actually deliver that? I've heard you talk a lot about like how maddening it is to have like 10 different platforms on your desktop to handle everything. Like, so your dashboard of managing a site or a series of sites for multiple trials, for multiple sponsors who are all using different platforms is nightmarish. So I'm not excited about creating yet another platform for sites and PIs to be navigating to try and serve content. So I'm trying to just kind of partner with people who are going to use the content in the way that makes sense for them and teach me what I need to build for them in the way of software to make it work within their workflow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, depending, again, you're going to have potentially all kinds of different clients. Like for me, envisioning what that looks like is, as long as it's hosted somewhere, our CTMS we use to shoot out patient reminders, visit reminders. So it'd be really easy to include a link somewhere in those visit reminders based off of, whatever time point they're at. which would really need another system or platform for. You just need it to be hosted somewhere that you can link to, which at the site level is really easy.
Can you send embed code in those messages, or does it have to be like a link to a website?
That's a good question, actually. You may have to like get some kind of URL shortener and just shoot a link. I'm not sure if it will let us actually embed.
Gotcha.
And that's a whole nother like interesting topic, the sort of how site and patient interaction happens, because we don't have the benefit of a lot of medical practices or big institutions having these portals where we can sort of have sort of easy two-way conversations. I think some clinical trial management systems are working towards sort of an equivalent, but most sites don't have that ability. So to your point, it could be because if you were like, here it is, but also it's a whole new system and you have to navigate it like totally differently, I might be like, well, shit, I don't know. That's more stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and I learned that because my early partners and customers like basically said that exact thing to me. They're like, oh God, we're not logging into another system. So what we've settled on is basically I give them embed code, which they just plug into their native websites, their homepages. So so basically what they do is they direct patients through a link to their own website. And that way kind of everybody wins. It's more of a positive sum game. They're getting like the SEO from patient eyeballs going to their own native websites. But I also serve my partners, customers with analytics, data analytics around engagement. And so they can see on a granular level which URLs are getting the most traction. So they can be a little bit smarter about their strategies for getting the message out, because they can see like which social channels are hitting with patients or providers, and just URLs are driving traffic and so forth. So you can see as either the sponsor or the PI kind of across the entire spectrum of your sites or your enrolling physicians, where is the engagement happening? So one advantage for a site is, sort of a moment of leverage as you like discuss back with your sponsor could be like, well, listen, like this, we're amplifying awareness around your trial. Look at how many views we have through our URL of your trial. We're educating patients. The message is getting out. And that actually is the whole goal for them. Like if the trials run successfully, it gets FDA approved. They need awareness in the community so that, frankly, they can sell their drug. So as a site, you get the advantage of basically like speeding up the consent process, providing a higher level of service for your patients, providing a better patient experience. But you also get a little bit of leverage, it seems, as you go back to negotiate with sponsors, because you're adding this extra service for them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and again, it's nice to have real metrics to go back to, because it's we're measured, by our advertising campaigns and things like that. So that's certainly useful. No, I love that model. I love the way it's set up. It sounds like it's not, you're not making the sort of fatal mistake of making it overly complicated for no good reason, keeping it simple, but still providing some useful metrics on the back end, which again, I think is huge. Do you guys do more generic like clinical trial education, and not for any like disease specific areas, something that's more like, look, this is how a clinical trial works, or this is what a clinical trial even is?
We haven't built content in that space where, I would like to, just because, kind of simple stuff like this is what a phase 1 trial, phase 2, phase 3, this is kind of what we're looking at. These are the kinds of people who are recruited to each phase. I think that we have sort of plans on the roadmap for that. We haven't done it yet. But as we do, you and I have interacted on LinkedIn. Generally, I just make it all public. None of it is like behind a paywall or anything. It's all just like free, open patient education. So generally, when we start making that stuff, it'll just all go up on LinkedIn and the other social channels so people can see it and feel free to share it with their patients. If they do share it, we know what sites it went on, because that helps us understand like where people are using it and stuff like that.
And so who, and you've alluded to this a little bit already, but who can work with you? If I'm a site, I've got studies. Love to be able to, get some more information out about those in a more practical way and, make it easy for people. So you work with sites directly. Is that something you guys are doing now?
I haven't worked with freestanding sites. The sites I've worked with are basically at the PI level. So it's been larger academic centers. I would love to work with sites, like not necessarily academic affiliated sites, but more like embedded in the community sites. However, a challenge for them, I've come to understand, is just like the financing of these kinds of things. So generally speaking, when I engage with either sites or PIs, they go up the ladder to the sponsor to secure funding for like this kind of custom content and stuff. So they then make the case up the ladder, and then we create the content, and then it can kind of filter out through the entire network that's actually enrolling on the trial. So that seems to be the way that like the full interaction wants to work. But when we create the content, the process of creating it, I write the copy, we have a team of graphics designers. Most of that interaction and collaboration happens between me and the sites or the PI, because everything is for IRB approval correctly should be sort of removed from the sponsor in terms of the patient facing content. I don't mind them having a look at it, so make sure they feel it's fair and represents what's, accurate as it relates to their product or their drug. But ultimately, it should be about patient education. And so there's a way that it should be worded to get through IRB to be fair and balanced about, not being coercive and not, being sort of perverse in providing incentives to patients that are not real in order to recruit their participation on a trial. So we really have our eye on the ball with that. And so generally the collaboration happens on the site and PI level, but the financing of it tends to happen at the sponsor level.
Yeah, and that's a whole other podcast about how that dynamic kind of flows between site and sponsor and what sites are willing to spend money on and they aren't. I mean, I'm finding, for us as a site, like making those investments can be really valuable even without sponsor backing. Ultimately it can still help our ROI. And to your point earlier, maybe if the sponsor is not paying for it, but if we're a high enrolling site and we go back and say, look, we're using this and it's helped, up our recruitment and engagement and retention. I mean, a lot of times then they will say, oh, okay, you know what? Well, we're happy to help support that or roll it out to their other sites that are on their studies. So
that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a potential, some potential there, like even for you guys, but even for sites like mine who are like, we're always looking to better engage with patients. And I think you mentioned earlier something we didn't touch on a lot, but referring physicians and referring practices. It's one thing to go in to a practice, ask for referrals, and they're like, yeah, sure, and then you don't really hear anything because you have to really manage that process. But if you can provide something for them, to leave behind for them and their patients, I mean, that could also potentially, significantly up your referral basis, just because there's something there, for them to latch onto sort of and engage with.
I think that's smart. And I think we can align incentives in some of these ways that are sort of creative ways to align incentives that are still ethical and sort of driving the field of medicine forward and giving patients access to better care. And so to be specific about that in this scenario, a referring physician, would like to be perceived in the community as a state-of-the-art provider who has access to clinical trials, which are desirable for patients with diseases that are difficult to treat. And so they can embed video on their own native websites. That is sort of a social proof for them and for their patients that they want to recruit to their practice. And so you can offer them potentially that, and then they can sort of leverage that to build their practice as well. And I used to have a less sort of favorable view of leveraging content in those kinds of ways, just because of the way we're sort of encoded as medical students. But at the end of the day, if it's created ethically, if it's driving towards a greater good of medical innovation and patient enrollment on trials, this is how we get smarter and better about delivering the best and newest standards of care, then I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it can certainly be done in a way where everybody wins and no one's, taken advantage of it in any way. So yeah, I love that. I know we're getting a little short on time. I want to shift gears a little bit. Something I love to ask, every guest that comes on is, what are, some tools or resources, tips? What are some things you use sort of in your everyday life? Doesn't have to be clinical research related, doesn't have to even be healthcare related, but what are maybe some things you use to just be the, best Dr. Grew you can be? What are some things you might share with the audience?
So a game changer for me was I got an iPad Pro and an Apple Pencil and this fancy $100 mic from Amazon. So I bought that stuff. So it was 3 tools, I guess. 4 tools really when you count the software. But I kind of started in my practice early in the pandemic where if there was something that I explained like 5 times in a week or 10 times in a month, then it probably is something that I should create a short piece of content to explain. Probably going to be better for my patients. It's going to be better for me. And it's just sort of a good way to exercise a different part of your brain so that you don't burn out. And just a creative outlet, basically. So when I started doing that, it just allowed me to communicate better, to get my thoughts out, to really examine how well do I really understand this? Can I explain it in a way that makes sense when I listen back to it later? Can it be enhanced with visuals and stuff? And so sort of those tools that I use together to share my thoughts about complex medical problems has really just opened up a whole new world of ideas and ways to just sort of like help patients at scale. The app that I use, which I'd like to give a free plug to, is Explain Everything. It's actually for teachers. And I just love the very simple interface. I'm sort of a monkey with the technology. So this thing even allows me to record and create simple graphics and stuff. And so I really love the app, and it's really just for like elementary school kids. And like I said, I'm kind of aiming for the 5th grade level. So it's like right in my strike zone.
Yeah, that's perfect. And, I think, you really can't, I don't think you can overstate the importance of having some sort of creative outlet, which you touched on. I love that idea. We're living in a world where there's a lot of burnout in the healthcare field right now. Things have been obviously insane for the last 2 or 3 years. It looks like some things are going to get worse before they get better. And just being able to sort of, you kind of have the best of both worlds there. You're able to, in one way, have a creative outlet that maybe can take your mind off of the day-to-day, but it's still contributing to the bigger picture of what you're doing at the same time. So, I kind of love that juxtaposition there. You kind of, it's like you're unwinding, but you're still contributing to what you're doing on a daily basis at the same time. So again, I really love that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's fun. It's supposed to be fun. And if it stopped being fun, then it's our job to kind of figure out a way to spin it around and make it fun again,
Yeah, that's cannot be overstated. Yeah. I love that. Well, anything else before we sign off here? No,
I really just want to thank you. Like, I've learned so much about clinical trials and how sites operate just from listening to your pod. So it's just been a phenomenal resource for me. The combination of the pod and your LinkedIn posts is just really helpful stuff, really insightful, simple, easy to follow. So keep it up. I'm enjoying it.
I appreciate that. Where can people find you online?
So you can email me. It's just my name, David Grew, at PRIMR Med. And PRIMR is no E, so it's PRIMRMED.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn, just my name, and then on Twitter at Dr. Grew.
Beautiful. Make sure that we drop those in the show notes. And look, I just want to thank you for coming on. I think what you're doing is awesome. And, not just in the clinical trial space, but obviously in a more broad application across just helping patients. So it's awesome. Again, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. If there's any way you think we can work together, let me know. I'd love to work together.
Yeah, I can say almost assuredly there is. So we'll talk offline.
Okay. Sounds good. All right.
Thanks, man.
Great.
As always, thank you so much for listening to Note to File Podcast. Make sure to check us out at notetofilepodcast.com for episode transcripts, show notes, and our guest contact information. Also, make sure and check out our weekly live streams on LinkedIn and YouTube. As always, thank you so much for listening.